The small old theater stood at the heart of the city like a forgotten memory of better times. The paint on its walls was peeling. The sign above the entrance flickered on and off, but inside there was a different kind of energy. The room was filled with nervous energy as hopeful young musicians shuffled in, each carrying their instruments and trying to steady their nerves for what could change their lives. They were here for the same thing, a chance to join a prestigious music program that could open doors for their futures. Among them was a young boy named Leo, who sat quietly in the corner clutching his violin case. Unlike the others, he wasn't wearing a perfectly pressed suit or carrying a shiny polished instrument. His clothes were worn, his shoes had seen better days, and his violin was chipped and scratched, its surface weathered from years of use. But it was all he had. For Leo, it wasn't about the instrument or the appearance, it was about the music. He had grown up in a small, crowded apartment on the outskirts of the city. His mother worked 2 jobs just to pay the bills, and his father was too ill to contribute much. Despite the constant struggle to make ends meet, Leo had always found comfort in the sound of his violin. His mother had saved up for months to buy it for him when he was young, and since then it had been his escape. When everything else seemed out of his control, he could always lose himself in the music. But today felt different. Today he was surrounded by students who looked like they belonged here, students who carried their instruments with ease, dressed in expensive clothes, their faces confident, as if they had been groomed for this moment their whole lives. And there was Leo, standing at the edge of their world, not sure if he truly belonged. He had practiced for this audition for months, but deep down, he felt unsure if he had what it took to succeed. As the other candidates stepped up to the stage one by one, Leo couldn't help but watch them. Their movements were graceful, their violins pristine, and their performances flawless. They looked like they were born to be here, while Leo felt like an outsider. His hands, though experienced, were trembling with nerves. He could hear the faint hum of the other students playing in the background, each note a reminder of how little he had compared to them. But he reminded himself that this was his moment. No matter how much doubt clouded his mind, he couldn't let it stop him. Finally, after what felt like hours, it was his turn. The call of his name echoed in the room, and he stood up slowly. His legs felt like they might give out, but he forced himself to walk to the stage. Every step felt like an eternity. He set his violin case down carefully on the stage, trying to steady his hands. He couldn't shake the feeling that everyone was watching him, judging him before he even had a chance to prove himself. When he looked up, his gaze met the cold, unblinking eyes of the director. She sat at the front of the room, her posture rigid, her expression unreadable. The stories about her were true. Evelyn was known for her sharp judgment and harsh critiques. She wasn't interested in stories of hardship or passion. She only cared about perfection. Leo knew that if he wanted to make it here, he would have to play flawlessly. He couldn't afford to mess up. He opened his violin case and pulled out the instrument. It felt heavier than usual, as though the weight of the moment was pressing down on him. His violin was scratched and worn, but it had been with him through every struggle. It was more than just an instrument. It was a companion that understood him better than anyone else. He wasn't going to let it down now. Taking a deep breath, Leo placed the violin on his shoulder. His hands were shaking, but he didn't let that stop him. He could feel the eyes of the room on him, waiting for him to start. The silence was deafening. With one final breath, he began to play. At first, the sound wasn't perfect. His bow wavered slightly, and his fingers fumbled on the strings. He could feel the eyes of the director on him, and it only made him more nervous. But as the music continued, Leo began to forget about the people watching him. His body relaxed, and the music flowed more naturally. This was his moment to shine, and he had to give everything he had. The piece he chose wasn't one of the grand, complicated compositions that many of the other students had picked. Instead, it was a simple folk song, one his mother used to sing to him when he was young. It wasn't a piece that demanded perfection, but it came from the heart. Leo wanted to show them that music wasn't about technique alone. It was about the feeling behind it. As he played, the room seemed to fade away. He could hear his own breath, the scrape of the bow against the strings, the gentle rise and fall of the melody. He closed his eyes, letting the music carry him, letting it tell the story of his life, the struggles, the hopes, and the dreams. The music was everything to him. It was the one thing that had always been his, the one thing he could always count on when the world seemed to turn its back on him. When he finished, The silence that followed felt like an eternity. Leo opened his eyes and waited. He didn't know what to expect. A part of him felt relieved that it was over, but another part of him was filled with fear. He had given everything he had to that performance, but was it enough? Evelyn, the director, didn't speak right away. She sat there staring at him. The room was still, every student holding their breath. And then, after what felt like an eternity, she finally spoke. "That was interesting," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "But you call that music?" Leo felt his stomach drop. He had been expecting criticism, but not like this. The way she spoke, so cold, so dismissive, hurt more than anything. He had poured his heart into this audition, and she was treating it like it was nothing. The other students were silent, watching the interaction with curiosity, but no one spoke up. Leo felt like the room was closing in on him. He wanted to say something to defend himself, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he just stood there, trying to keep his composure. Evelyn's gaze was sharp, and she continued, "You'll need to do better than that if you want to make it in this world. Passion doesn't make up for skill, and you're clearly lacking in both." Leo's heart sank. The tears threatened to spill, but he held them back. He wasn't going to cry in front of them. He had to be strong. He didn't say a word. Instead, he quietly packed up his violin, feeling the weight of her words like a heavy burden on his chest. As he walked off the stage, the eyes of the other students followed him. He could feel their judgment, their pity, but he didn't let it show. He wasn't going to let this defeat him. He had worked too hard to give up now. His journey wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The door to the audition room closed behind him, and Leo stood in the hallway, his heart racing. He wanted to run, to escape the embarrassment, but something inside him told him to keep going. He had made it this far, and he wasn't going to stop now. With a deep breath, Leo wiped away the tears that had started to fall and turned toward the door. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to let a single person's harsh words define him. He had a dream, and he was going to chase it no matter what. Leo walked away from the audition room with a heavy heart. The words of the director, harsh and cutting, echoed in his mind, making it difficult to think clearly. He had spent so much time preparing, practicing, and dreaming of this moment only for it to be torn apart in a matter of seconds. As he stepped into the dim hallway of the theater, he felt like the walls were closing in around him. The weight of failure was heavy on his shoulders, and he wasn't sure how to shake it off. He stopped for a moment, leaning against the cool brick wall. His mind was a whirlwind of confusion, self-doubt, and frustration. Was it really that bad? He had tried so hard, poured so much of himself into the performance, but the director hadn't seen it that way. To her, his music was just noise. Was he really not good enough? Was there something wrong with him? Or was it just that his background wasn't like the others? No fancy clothes, no expensive violin, no perfect technique. His eyes stung as he fought back the tears. He had always known that the odds were stacked against him. He wasn't born into privilege. His mother worked tirelessly to support the family, doing everything she could to make ends meet, but there was never enough. Leo had learned early in life that things were never easy. But what he didn't know was how to fight back against the world's judgments, how to show them that he was more than just his circumstances. For years, music had been his refuge. Whenever life got too hard, when the world seemed too big, too overwhelming, he turned to his violin. It was his way of expressing everything that words couldn't say. But now, standing here in the quiet hallway of the theater, Leo wasn't sure what he was supposed to do next. The door he had hoped would open seemed firmly shut in his face. His mind wandered back to his childhood. Growing up in a small apartment on the outskirts of the city, Leo had learned early on the meaning of struggle. His mother worked long hours at 2 different jobs to support the family. Sometimes Leo would wake up to find her already gone, and he would come home to an empty apartment waiting for her to return. His father, who had once been strong and full of life, had slowly been worn down by illness. Leo's memories of his father were a blur, once a man full of laughter, now a shadow of himself. Despite all of this, Leo had never felt sorry for himself. His mother did everything she could to provide for him, and he loved her more than anything. But there were times, especially in the quiet of the night, when he felt the weight of their situation. He knew what it was like to go without, to make do with what little you had. But it was also during those quiet moments that Leo found his passion. When things were hard, he would pick up his violin and play, letting the music fill the empty space in the room. Music had always been his escape, his way of coping with the harshness of the world around him. He remembered the day his mother had brought home the violin. She had saved up for months to buy it for him, a small but beautiful instrument that was more than just wood and strings. It was a symbol of hope, of something better. She had placed it in his hands and told him, "This is your future, Leo. Hold on to it." And he had, with everything he had. The violin became his world, his refuge from everything that weighed him down. But now, after the audition, Leo felt like that world was crumbling. The director's words still stung, and he wondered if he was foolish for believing that he could make it in a world that seemed so far removed from his reality. The wealthy students who had walked in with their polished instruments and expensive clothes, he wasn't like them. He didn't have what they had, and maybe that was the problem. Maybe that was why he would never fit in. As he stood in the hallway, his mind continued to race. But there was one thing he knew for sure: he couldn't give up. He couldn't let a single rejection define him. His mother had always taught him to keep going, no matter how hard things got. She had taught him that the only way to succeed was to fight, to keep pushing forward even when the world told him to stop. With a deep breath, Leo wiped away the tear that had slipped down his cheek. He wasn't going to let this defeat him. He had worked too hard, come too far to give up now. There had to be a way to prove himself, to show the world that he had something to offer. For the next few days, Leo stayed in his small apartment, practicing. He played for hours, his fingers growing sore, but he didn't stop. Every note he played was a defiance against the rejection he had faced. He played with everything he had, his hopes, his fears, his dreams. Each time he picked up his violin, he reminded himself that this was his path, and no one, not even the director, could take that away from him. But as the days turned into weeks, Leo began to doubt. He practiced, but he felt like something was missing. His music didn't feel the same. It wasn't that he had lost his passion. It was that the rejection had left a mark. He couldn't shake the feeling that maybe the director had been right. Maybe he wasn't good enough. It was during one of these moments of doubt that Leo's mother sat down beside him. She had always been his biggest supporter, the one person who believed in him when no one else did. She looked at him with kind eyes, her face worn from years of hard work, and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Leo," she said softly, "I know this is hard, but you can't let one person's opinion define you. You have something special inside of you. I've always known that. And if you keep believing in yourself, the world will see it too." Her words were simple, but they gave him the strength to keep going. He couldn't let a single rejection stop him. He couldn't let the world decide what he was capable of. The music was his, and he was going to fight for it. From that day on, Leo made a promise to himself. He wasn't going to stop. No matter how many doors were closed in his face, he would keep playing. And maybe, just maybe, one day someone would hear the music and recognize its worth. As the weeks went by, Leo's playing improved. He felt the music flowing through him again, like it had when he was younger. It wasn't about perfection. It was about passion, about telling a story through the strings of his violin. He practiced late into the night, pouring his heart into every note. And though he still felt the sting of rejection, he found solace in the music. It was the one thing that could never be taken from him. But despite his progress, Leo knew that he couldn't do it alone. He needed guidance, he needed help. And so, with a renewed sense of purpose, he decided to seek out another opportunity. He wasn't going to let one failed audition be the end of his journey. There had to be another way. And so Leo set out to find that way. He didn't know what it would be, but he was determined to keep going. Because deep down, he knew that this was just the beginning. Leo's hands had become familiar with the worn strings of his violin. Each day, he sat with the instrument in his hands, the music filling the quiet spaces in his room. He had made a promise to himself. He wouldn't stop. Even after the director's harsh dismissal, even after the long nights of practicing alone, Leo couldn't let go of his dream. The sound of the violin was all he had left. It was his comfort, his escape from everything that weighed him down. The small apartment where he had grown up had always felt too tight, the walls closing in on him as his family struggled to make ends meet. But in that room with his violin in his hands, Leo could breathe. The music was his way of expressing the things he couldn't say, the way he could speak to the world even when it seemed like the world wasn't listening. His mother's voice often echoed in his mind. reminding him that dreams were worth chasing, even when the world made it difficult to believe in them. His mother had always supported him, never once telling him to give up on music. She knew that it was more than just a hobby for him. It was his way of making sense of the world. Leo thought about her often, especially in the quiet moments when his doubts crept in. She worked tirelessly, juggling 2 jobs to keep food on the table, but still managed to find time to listen to him play, her tired eyes lighting up as the music filled the room. She never judged, never told him he wasn't good enough. She just listened. But despite her support, Leo still struggled with his own insecurities. He had always known that he didn't come from a place of privilege. His violin was old and scratched, nothing like the polished instruments that many of the other students had. His clothes weren't brand new. His family didn't have money to spare. He had always been told that if you wanted to succeed in this world, you had to be perfect. You had to have the right connections, the right training, the right instruments, and Leo had none of that. As the days passed, Leo kept practicing. Every note he played felt like a battle against his own fear and self-doubt. He pushed himself harder each day, trying to perfect his technique. But the harder he tried, the more frustrated he became. He knew that the music had to come from somewhere deep inside, but it was hard to find that connection when all he could focus on was how much he didn't have. He wanted to be like the others, polished, confident, ready for whatever came next. But he wasn't. He was just a boy with a dream and a violin that had seen better days. One afternoon, after a particularly difficult practice session, Leo stepped outside to clear his head. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the city streets. It was one of those moments when everything seemed quiet, almost peaceful. Leo walked for hours, lost in his thoughts, his feet carrying him wherever they wanted to go. The noise of the city seemed distant, as though the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. As he walked, Leo thought about the audition. He thought about the director's words, about how she had looked at him with cold eyes and dismissed his music as nothing more than noise. He thought about the other students, the ones who had seemed so sure of themselves, their violins shining in the light. He thought about how for a moment he had felt invisible, as if no one could see him, and it hurt. It hurt more than he had let on. He had worked so hard, and yet it hadn't been enough. But as he continued walking, something changed. He didn't know why, but the weight of his doubt seemed to lift just a little. The streets were filled with people going about their daily lives, their faces tired but determined. Leo saw a street musician playing his guitar on the corner, the music filling the air with a sense of freedom. The man wasn't playing for anyone's approval. He was just playing because he loved the music. Leo stopped for a moment, watching him. There was no polish, no perfect technique. It was raw, real, and beautiful. The music filled Leo with a sense of peace. The man played for himself, and in doing so, he made the whole street listen. It didn't matter if his guitar was new or old. It didn't matter if his technique was perfect. All that mattered was that he was playing with his heart. Leo stood there for a while, letting the music wash over him. And in that moment, he realized something. It wasn't about perfection. It wasn't about having the best violin or the most expensive lessons. It was about playing from the heart, about sharing the music with others. And if he could do that, then maybe he could make a difference. With renewed determination, Leo returned home. He didn't practice that night. Instead, he sat in his room, his violin resting on his lap, and thought about what he had just experienced. The music he wanted to play had to come from within. It wasn't about impressing anyone. It wasn't about being perfect. It was about expressing the emotions that lived inside him, the feelings he could never put into words. The next day, Leo woke up with a new sense of purpose. He knew he wasn't ready to give up on his dreams, but he also knew that he couldn't do it the way he had been. He couldn't keep trying to measure up to someone else's standards. He had to find his own voice, his own way of playing. It wasn't about competing with the others. It was about finding his own place in the world. For the next few weeks, Leo played with more freedom. His music no longer felt like a struggle. It felt like a conversation, a way to connect with the world around him. His practice sessions were no longer about perfection. They were about exploring the emotions that music brought out in him, about letting the music take him wherever it wanted to go. He didn't stop thinking about the audition. But now when he thought about it, he didn't feel the same sense of shame or frustration. Instead, he saw it as just one part of his journey, He had learned something important from that experience. The director had dismissed him, yes, but she hadn't taken away his love for music. She hadn't taken away his passion. No one could do that. A few weeks later, Leo received a call from the music school. His heart skipped a beat as he answered. It was the director. At first, Leo's mind went blank and he thought he was about to be told that his audition had been a mistake. But to his surprise, she told him that they had reconsidered his application. She had heard from one of the other teachers that Leo had continued to practice and improve, despite the rejection. And she wanted to see him again. Leo couldn't believe it. The door that had seemed closed to him just a few months ago was now opening again. But this time, he wasn't going in with the same nerves or fear that had held him back before. This time he was going in with the knowledge that he didn't need to be perfect. He just needed to be himself. When the day of the re-audition arrived, Leo didn't feel the same sense of dread he had felt before. He was nervous, of course, but it wasn't the same. He walked into the audition room with his head held high, his violin case in hand. The director was there along with a few other staff members, but this time it felt different. This time he wasn't afraid to be himself. Leo played not with the fear of failure, but with the freedom that came from knowing that the music was his to share. And when he finished, there was a moment of silence just like before. But this time it wasn't filled with judgment. It was filled with something else, a recognition of the passion that Leo had put into his performance. The director stood up, a look of surprise on her face. She had expected a good performance, but she hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected Leo to play with so much heart. And for the first time, Leo felt like he had truly been seen. The days that followed the re-audition felt like a blur to Leo. There was a sense of disbelief in the air, as if he had somehow stepped into a different world. After months of struggle, of trying to prove himself, he had been given a second chance, a chance he had not expected. The director, who had once dismissed him so coldly, now seemed to see something in him. But Leo didn't let the surprise overwhelm him. He knew that this moment didn't mean the journey was over. It was only the beginning. The first day of the music program arrived with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. Leo's heart raced as he walked through the gates of the prestigious school, the weight of his violin case heavier than ever. The campus was magnificent. Green lawns, grand buildings, and students who looked like they had been born for this. They wore their instruments like they were an extension of themselves, their faces confident, their posture perfect. Leo stood out like a sore thumb. He didn't belong here in their world of luxury and ease. But he was here, and that was all that mattered. The other students barely acknowledged him as they walked past. They were absorbed in their own little worlds, talking about their experiences, their achievements, their perfect technique. Leo felt like an outsider, someone who had snuck in by mistake. His shoes were worn, his clothes less expensive, and his violin wasn't as polished as the others. But as he walked to his first class, he reminded himself that none of that mattered. The only thing that mattered was the music. As the days passed, Leo quickly realized that this was not going to be an easy ride. The program was rigorous. The instructors pushed the students hard, demanding perfection in every note, every movement. For Leo, it was overwhelming. The pressure to perform at a high level was constant. He was surrounded by students who had been trained in the best schools, students who had resources Leo could only dream of. Some of them played effortlessly, their technique flawless, while Leo stumbled at times, unsure of whether he was good enough to be here. But despite all the challenges, Leo found himself drawn to the music more than ever. He couldn't explain it, but every time he picked up his violin, it felt like he was tapping into something deeper, something more profound. He played with the emotion he had carried inside for so long, the emotion that had made him practice through the late nights, the emotion that had made him fight for his place in this world. And even when the doubt crept in, when he felt like he didn't belong, he reminded himself that music was all he had. It was the one thing that made sense in a world that so often didn't. In one of his classes, Leo had to perform in front of his peers for the first time. His stomach twisted in knots as he stepped onto the stage, his violin clutched tightly in his hands. The room was filled with students, each one watching him intently, judging his every move. The instructor, a man who was known for his strict critiques, stood at the front, arms folded, waiting for Leo to play. Leo took a deep breath and began. The notes were shaky at first, his bow slightly out of tune, but as he played, the room seemed to fade away. He didn't care anymore about the judgment. He just played, letting the music flow through him, letting it express everything he couldn't say. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was just trying to feel the music, to let it come from the depths of his soul. When he finished, there was a long silence. Leo's heart pounded in his chest. He hadn't been perfect, but he had given everything he had. He could hear the faint whisper of other students talking, but he didn't dare look up. He didn't want to know what they thought. The instructor, a tall man with sharp features, stepped forward and looked at Leo for a moment, before speaking. "That was interesting," he said, his voice cold. Leo's stomach dropped. He had expected some sort of criticism, but hearing those words felt like a punch to the gut. "Your technique needs work," the instructor continued. "But there's something there, something raw, something real. Keep at it. You're not there yet, but you're on the right path." The words stung, but they also lit a fire inside Leo. He wasn't perfect, but he had something. The instructor had seen it. Something that couldn't be taught, something that came from within. And for the first time in weeks, Leo felt a spark of hope. Maybe he could do this. Maybe he could make it. In the days that followed, Leo worked even harder. He spent every free moment practicing, trying to refine his technique, trying to make his sound more polished. But even as he worked on his technique, he never lost sight of what had brought him here in the first place: the music, the emotion, the passion that he poured into every note. It wasn't enough to just play the right notes. He needed to play with heart, with feeling. But as the weeks went by, Leo found himself feeling more isolated. The other students, though polite, seemed to have no interest in getting to know him. They had their own groups, their own lives, and Leo couldn't shake the feeling that he was always on the outside looking in. The wealth and privilege that surrounded him only seemed to highlight how different his life had been. They had never known struggle like he had. They had never known what it was like to fight for every opportunity, to make do with what little you had, and sometimes that made him feel small, invisible. One afternoon, Leo was sitting in the cafeteria picking at his food when a voice interrupted his thoughts. "You're Leo, right? The violinist?" He looked up to see a girl standing in front of him. She was one of the students from his class, someone he had seen around but hadn't spoken to before. She was holding a tray of food and her eyes were friendly, not judging like the others. "Yeah," Leo said, a little surprised. "That's me." "I've heard you play," she said, taking a seat across from him. "You've got something special. You don't play like the rest of us. You play with heart." Leo blinked, surprised by her words. No one had ever said that to him before. The other students only cared about technique, about perfection. But this girl saw something different in him. I don't know how to play any other way," Leo said, his voice quiet. "I've always played like that," she smiled. "Don't stop. That's what music is about. Feeling it, not just playing the right notes." For the first time in a while, Leo felt a sense of connection, a sense of belonging. Maybe he wasn't like everyone else, but that didn't mean he didn't have something to offer. The girl's words were like a light in the darkness, reminding him that he didn't have to be like everyone else. He could be himself. As the weeks turned into months, Leo began to settle into his place at the school. He worked harder than ever, refining his technique while staying true to the raw emotional quality that made his music unique. He still felt out of place at times, but those moments were fewer now. He had learned to embrace his journey, his struggles, and the things that made him different. They were part of who he was, and they were part of what made his music special. Leo wasn't perfect. He would never be. But he didn't need to be. He just needed to be himself, and that was enough. Leo's time at the music school was no longer about proving himself to others. It was no longer about the judgment of the director or the pressure of competing against students who seemed so much more polished than him. Over the months, Leo had learned to embrace the music he played, not for the approval of others, but for the way it made him feel alive. His violin had become an extension of himself, and when he played, it was as though his heart was speaking directly through the strings. No longer afraid of mistakes or imperfections, he focused on making his music real. The instructors had noticed the change in Leo. He no longer tried to fit into their mold of perfection, but instead, he found his own way of expressing the music that no one else could replicate. His playing had rawness, emotion, and sincerity. While others focused on technical precision, Leo's music captured something deeper, something that resonated with anyone who listened closely enough. And slowly, the respect from his peers began to grow. They saw his passion, his commitment, and his willingness to be vulnerable through his playing. Leo wasn't the most technically perfect student, but he had something they didn't. His music came from his soul. One day after class, one of the students approached him. It was the girl who had first spoken to him in the cafeteria, the one who had told him not to stop playing from the heart. She had been watching him closely over the past few months, and there was a look of admiration in her eyes as she spoke. "You've really grown," she said, a smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "I can see it now. Your music is different. It's not like anyone else's. It's real." Leo felt his heart swell at her words. He had never thought of his playing as anything special, but hearing her say it made him realize how far he had come. "Thank you," he said, his voice quiet but filled with gratitude. "I've just been playing the way I feel. That's all I know how to do." "That's exactly what makes it so powerful," she replied. "You've stopped worrying about what others think. You're playing for yourself now." Her words stuck with him long after they parted ways. He had stopped trying to meet the expectations of others, stopped comparing himself to the perfect students who seemed to glide through their lessons without a care in the world. He had learned to embrace his flaws, to accept that he would never be perfect, and that was okay. In fact, it made him better. It made his music more authentic, more real. As the weeks continued to pass, Leo's confidence grew. He began to push himself further, exploring different genres, different styles of music. He was no longer content to stay within the boundaries of what he had been taught. He experimented with improvisation, letting his emotions guide him, letting his violin tell the story. He felt the music in a way that was unique to him, and each performance was a part of his journey. He wasn't playing for approval anymore. He was playing because he had to. It was who he was. But even as he grew more confident, Leo couldn't forget where he came from. He remembered the long nights spent practicing in his small, dimly lit room. He remembered the struggles of his childhood, the days when he had no idea if he would ever get the chance to follow his dreams. And he remembered his mother, who had always believed in him, who had given up so much just to support him. Leo owed everything to her. One evening, as he was practicing alone in the studio, his mother called him. Her voice was warm, comforting, as it always was, but there was something different in her tone. She told him that she had come across an old letter from when he was just a boy, one that she had written to herself, a letter full of hope and dreams for him. In it, she had written, "One day Leo will make his mark in the world. He'll prove to everyone that he is more than his circumstances." Leo sat down with the phone pressed to his ear, overwhelmed by the emotions that flooded him. His mother had never told him about the letter before, and hearing her words made him realize how far he had come. She had always believed in him, even when he hadn't believed in himself. Even when the world had seemed to be against him, she had been his unwavering support. "I never knew you kept that letter," Leo said, his voice thick with emotion. "I kept it because I always knew you would make it," his mother replied. "You're not just a boy with a violin, Leo. You're so much more than that. You've always had the heart, the determination, the drive, and I've seen that shine through no matter what anyone else said." Leo felt a lump form in his throat. He had worked so hard, struggled so much, and yet hearing those words from his mother made it all worth it. She had believed in him when no one else did, and now, all of his sacrifices, his long hours of practice, his nights spent away from his family were finally paying off. The following months were some of the busiest of Leo's life. He had been given more performance opportunities, and his confidence had continued to grow. But even as the accolades began to roll in, Leo remained humble. He remembered the times when he had doubted himself, when he had thought he would never make it. He knew that success wasn't just about recognition or applause, it was about the music, the passion, and the journey. One afternoon, as he was practicing in the studio, he was interrupted by a knock on the door. When he opened it, he was greeted by the director, the one who had once dismissed him so harshly. She stood there looking as stern as ever, but there was something different in her eyes, a hint of respect. "Perhaps, I've been listening to your performances," she said, her tone more measured than it had been before. "I was wrong about you. You have something special. I can see it now. You've earned your place here." Leo was taken aback. He had never expected to hear those words from her. But there they were, and in that moment he realized how far he had come. He had proven not just to the director but to himself that he belonged here. He didn't need her approval to validate his talent. He had earned it through his dedication, his passion, and his willingness to stay true to who he was. "I appreciate that," Leo said, his voice steady but full of emotion. "But I didn't do it for you. I did it for the music." The director gave him a small nod, a slight smile on her face. "That's the right answer." As the days went by, Leo continued to grow as both a musician and a person. He had come so far from the boy who had been rejected in that cold audition room. Now he was a young man with a bright future ahead of him, someone who had fought for his dreams, someone who had learned that true success wasn't about perfection, it was about passion. It was about staying true to yourself, even when the world tried to tell you that you weren't good enough. One evening, after a particularly successful performance, Leo stood backstage, listening to the applause that filled the auditorium. He smiled to himself, feeling the warmth of the moment. He had made it. He had overcome the doubts, the challenges, and the rejection. And now, as he stood there, he knew one thing for sure. This was just the beginning. He wasn't done yet. And whatever came next, he would face it with the same heart, the same passion, and the same determination that had brought him this far. The world was waiting, and Leo was ready. "Let me know if you need any further changes or additions." You said, write part 5, in 1,400 words without heading. In simple English words in a separate document. It should be interesting, and every part should be engaging so the audience doesn't get bored. Also keep the wording simple and natural tone. Also make the script human-centric and don't give feel of AI-generated. Also don't create violated content which can affect YouTube policy. Also don't use names like Marcus, Sarah, Emma, Jamal, etc. ChatGPT said,